In this lesson, we will describe the slave trade and the role of slavery in the plantation economy and describe life for colonial slaves. Slavery involved a high initial payment, but slaves worked for life and offspring belonged to the owners. Most whites felt that dark skin made people inferior or not as smart as lighter-skinned people. The triangular trade route was very important as part of the slave trade. Caribbean sugar was part of an important trading network that was called the triangular trade route, which you see in the picture on the video. British ships made 3 legs on each voyage. From New England and the colonies, rum and other goods were taken to Africa, where they were traded for African slaves. The African slaves were then taken from Africa to the West Indies, where they were traded for rum and molasses, and then finally would move on back to the colonies. The middle section of the triangular trade route, shown here, is called the Middle Passage. In 1690, there were 13,000 slaves in America. By 1750, 200,000 slaves, and by 1850, the amount of slaves had increased to over 4 million slaves in America. The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the slave trip across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a brutal trip. Africans spoke different languages and did not comprehend what was happening when they were taken from Africa and loaded onto ships. Some thought they would be eaten by the white men. 20% of the human cargo died, especially if they were tight-packed. You can see a slave ship on the video screen in this picture that shows how closely together the slaves were packed in the ship. The tighter they were packed, the more slaves could fit in a slave ship. This picture shows how the slaves were transported along the route to the West Indies and then finally to the colonies. Some slaves threw themselves overboard and committed suicide. Others died of sickness because of conditions below the decks. Slaves that survived were auctioned off in America, following a stop in the West Indies. Slavery in the South. Once on the plantation, slaves lived in slave quarters near the big house. They had no rights. They were treated as property, not as people. And they were beaten and sold as punishment for infractions or for breaking rules. There were fewer slaves sold in the North because they did not have labor-intensive farming. In order to cope in the New World, Africans learned English and they learned about Christianity, but they kept much of their heritage. Slave life was encouraged extended families for support. Many slaves tried to sabotage their owners by working slowly, breaking tools, faking illnesses, pretending not to understand their duties. Slaves were intentionally given different jobs. Some of these jobs were better than others. A cook or a driver got better food and clothes than the lowest slave, which was a field hand, and this created competition between the slaves. Resistance and revolt. Africans occasionally revolted in America. Slaves near the Stono River, just south of Charleston, South Carolina, gathered weapons and killed many white people. The local militia put down the rebellion, and many slaves died. This frightened Southerners, and slave codes were strengthened to discourage rebellions. Some slaves ran away and hid with Native Americans. The bigger the plantations grew, the more dependent Southerners became on slave labor. It's called the peculiar institution because it was supported by Southern churches. Immigrants from Europe did not settle in the South because there were no jobs available that paid wages because of the slave labor. Plantation owners were forced to buy more and more slaves. The more slaves they bought, the bigger the plantations got, and the less jobs were available for immigrants. Immigrants settled mostly in the North as a result.